Hello and welcome to the program. I am Suren. Concentrate now upon the powers of the mind. The human mind certainly presents a huge mystery. The more we discover about the functions of the mind, the more mysterious it becomes. Agree? There are obstacles in understanding this mystery, and we have only our finite minds for solving it. And all we have got now for ourselves, yet another mystery to resolve the actual mystery. Question: how does the mind function? What is indeed ESP, and how does that work? What is the limit of memory's capacity? What is the limit of intelligence? How do human brains unite to establish great feats? Like, for example, landing people on the moon or Mars, inventing television, radar, cars, planes. How does one's imagination work? How can so many ideas function in the psychological realm? Why we have so many types of religions, beliefs, guesses and theories? Are there any limits to the powers of the mind? An extraterrestrial man certainly demonstrated his mental powers. I'm sure you're familiar with him. Who was that who became so well known and demonstrating many unusual powers than any other man who has ever lived on planet Earth? Jesus of Nazareth. He certainly exercised very unusual and miraculous powers, so that many have believed in his performed miracles because he followed all the natural laws, a system reserved for God. There are people today who could not accept anything but the power of the mind because the stories of miracles are so fantastic to be true. He demonstrated the mental ability by first changing the water into wine at a feast. And Jesus saith unto them, fill the water pots with water. And they filled them up to the brim. He saith unto them, go out now, and bear unto the governor of the feast. But the ruler of the feast tasted the water. It was made wine. And not when it was governor of the feast called the bridegroom. And unto every man at the beginning doth set for a good wine. And when men have well drunk, then that which is worse, but that has kept the good wine until now. This beginning of miracles did Jesus in Cana of Galilee, and manifested for his glory, and his disciples believed in him. John chapter 2, verses 7 to 11. Indeed, he had the power to heal. When Jesus saw him lie and knew that he had been a long time, and he saith unto him, that he will be made whole. The man answered him, Sire, I have no man when the water is troubled to put me into the pool, but while I'm coming, another step it down before me. Jesus saith unto him, Rise, "Take up the bed and walk." And immediately the man was made whole, and took up his bed and walked. And on the same day was the Sabbath. John chapter 5, verses 6 to 9. He had the power to multiply 5 loaves and 2 fishes into sufficient food to feed over 5,000 people. John chapter 6, verses 10 to 13. He also made the blind see. John 9, 1 and 7. Probably one of his greatest miraculous feats was exercising the powers of his mind to raise Lazarus from the dead. And when he had spoken, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come forth!" And he that was dead came forth, bound hand and foot with grave cloths. And his face was bound about with a napkin. Jesus saith to him, "Loose him, and let him go." John 11, verses 43 and 44. And an even greater power of his mind was that he did not remain dead when murdered. He was placed in a tomb, but on the 3rd day was seen alive again. John chapter 20, verses 11 to 15. He could also pass through the walls of a room. Same day at evening, being the first day of the week, when the doors were shut, when disciples were assembled for fear of the Jews, Jesus stood in the midst and saith unto them, "Peace be unto you." John chapter 20, verse 19. Probably the greatest power of all was his ability to control his great power. His powers were never used for his own gain or interest. What human on earth today, if he had powers like Christ, would not use them for his own gain? Question mark. Could anyone have sufficient control of himself to withhold the use of unlimited mental powers to prevent himself from being killed? Jesus did this. He permitted himself to be hung from a wooden structure. Only a mind with powers far beyond anything we can visualize could exercise such stupendous control. What are mental powers? Are they available for everybody? After, as the scientist Adrian Clark says, Christ rose into the universal transport cloud, as we see in Acts chapter 1, verse 9, and returned to heaven world, many of his powers were bestowed upon him and his followers. The believers have recorded the Acts of Apostles had most unusual powers of healing, and they were able to understand many foreign languages. They could do so much more things, and people have had at random very unusual and very unexpected powers. And those powers did not just develop through some kind of schooling, but they were inherited from birth or given to them somehow during their lives. Now, Ted Serios, we have spoken about, has demonstrated the qualities of a modern mind, as he had amazing ability to impress images on photographic film. We have done so too. Any fear of this nature seems illogical and unreasonable, and certainly not associated with any of the known effects of science, and scientists or other scientifically minded people would simply ignore. Heisenberg's story is another wild science fiction tale. Once an assumption is made that information is false, nothing can be learned from that information, even though it may be absolutely true. Scientist has developed a theory which could explain this phenomenon before hearing the story, although he could accept the story as a point for consideration. He was surprised that there was a person with a capability that Sirius exercised. This theory of how he impressed images on photographic film was already presented before, so I will not dwell on that at this stage. This unusual ability indicates that Sirius had a communication link with the universal intelligence who was able to impress the images on the film through psychokinesis. Indeed, thoughts can move a mountain. If you can recall what Jesus said, as we read in Matthew chapter 17, verse 20, "If ye have faith as a grain of mustard seed, ye shall say unto this mountain, Remove hence you to wander to yonder place, and it shall remove, and nothing shall be impossible unto you." What does this mean? Can we move mountains by thought alone? Although it seems impossible, mountains have been moved by thought. Many mountains, or large portions of them, have been moved by bulldozers and other heavy earth-moving equipment. Someone had the thoughts of cutting away the mountains before they were moved. Does that mean that by thinking about it and planning and spending the necessary money, furnishing the bulldozers and drivers, that finally mountain can be moved? Question mark. Perhaps it does require just one thing: faith. Scientist Clark says, additional ideas also cascaded in my mind, such as, yes, objects can be moved by thinking alone, but that is not the method for us to be using yet. Many controls and restrictions may be involved in moving objects by thought, like rules for driving a car. One of those who is reported to have moved object by thought was a young girl who lived in a rural area, a daughter of a Baptist deacon, and discovered early in her life that she could move objects about her room. Through trial and error, she developed more control of the movement of objects until she could prevent a person from touching her if she so desired. After her unusual ability became known, and she was in demand as a performer. A typical performance would be to invite any man in the audience to come up and try to touch her. As the person approached her, would be thrown back across the stage with tremendous force. So the skeptics claimed that she was using a trick of some sort. No one could determine exactly what her special trick was. In a different demonstration, she effortlessly lifted a heavy man sitting in a chair. With a man seated in the chair, she would place her hand under it, raise the entire chair, and then completely over her head. She was tested while performing this demonstration by a group of scientists, Washington, D.C. They checked her weight and man's weight and the chair's weight separately and in combination during the performance. They found that when she was standing on the scales, lifting the man in the chair, they measured weight was not as great as the separate weights of the three. And Anne Gaiman discovered, when she was very young, she had very unusual ability to cause a table to levitate. In 1968, she put on a demonstration for Jean Yothers in Casadega, Florida. In this, she used a small, inconspicuous mahogany table, on top of which both she and Yothers, a writer for the Orlando Sentinel, placed their hands. The unorthodox procedure was to ask the table a question. According to Gaiman, the table would be moved by spirits to answer no with 2 rocks and on the table, and yes with 3. Apparently, Anne persuaded the spirits not only to move the table 2 or 3 times, but also to move it back and forth, with the table gaining momentum until it was spinning madly around and around like a top. Mysteriously, it gradually lifted off the floor, settled back, and a theory which could explain the movement of the table. With my partner, we have experienced the same with a very light table after a meditation gathering at some friend's home after the guests have left. They have apparently tried to lift or have had the table lift itself. We all have placed our hands on the top of the table, and we discovered the table started to rock after a short while of silent meditation. And indeed, the rocking of the table started to become more frequent and faster, and it started to move towards the people, including my partner, and finally towards myself, until I made mention of that. Now it was time to stop rocking, just simply raise the table and put it down gently. And it happened. Was it a poltergeist activity? Was it psychokinesis? Was it our minds doing the moving? Or was it done by any other invisible extraterrestrial being? Poltergeist is said to be a spirit or ghost who throws objects around, often breaking them and damaging them. In many cases, either a young boy or a young girl has been associated with this unusual phenomenon. Eileen Garrett has investigated very unusual poltergeist occurrences. She thought that poltergeists were usually associated with tragic experiences preceding a person's death, postulating that ghost of the unfortunate person in the vicinity of the tragedy trying to attract the attention of someone by throwing objects about. The son of a retired admiral in the British Navy seemed to be associated with objects being thrown about his father's home. The boy's mother had often heard unusual footsteps and noticed an arrangement of shoes after they had moved into this eventful house. One day, the admiral was seated at a table when the scotch and soda on the table began to mysteriously move away from him without any reason. As the surprised admiral gazed in open-mouthed astonishment, the glass slid all the way to the edge of the table, crushed to the floor, and shattered into many pieces. According to Garrett, the reason for an unhappy spirit being involved in this episode was because a relative had died and left the will, which had been displaced, and the spirit was trying to attract the attention of these people so they could locate the will. Through Eileen's help, the will was located, and the poltergeist retired from the scene. Many other unusual poltergeist cases have been reported through the years, which I'm not intending to include in here. Way back in 1965, we used to hear about Henry Gross, a water dowser, who had an unusual stick. It was actually a common forked stick, which had been cut from a peach or an apple tree, and had a very interesting ability to answer questions about water. Henry apparently used the stick for water dowsing like any other common ones, which he would hold the end of the forked stick in his hands and walk across the fields until the end of the stick dipped down. The end of the fields, until the end of the stick pointed forward towards the ground, there was always water beneath the stick underground. It is said that he had developed his ability. His fame spread, and water was found where his stick indicated it. Gross was found to be a very reliable dowser. He developed a technique of simply asking the stick a question, which could be answered either yes or no, such as, "Is there water on Mr. Smith's farm?" If the stick dipped, it signified yes. If it remained stationary, it signified no. Henry Gross located water in Bermuda from a map. Bermuda is now a good supply of local fresh water. Was Gross controlled by a spirit? Was his stick controlled by the spirit? Was there some other unknown natural law involved? That's a good question. There are many water dowsers who would hold a footstick in their hands, walking around the ground and saying that they have located water. Sometimes the brass rods are supposed to went over water. Both rods were L-shaped, with the small end of the L held, one in each hand, with the long part of the L pointing straight ahead as the dowsers walked. These simple brass rods were commonly used very successfully for locating underground tunnels in Vietnam. These water dowsers walked very confidently across the lawn and apparently located water, but it wasn't where the previous water dowser had located the water. They also walked over underground water pipes in the area, and one of them found water when passing over a water pipe. Reliable water dowsers, do they receive information on underground water by an ESP signal to their brains, which unconsciously moves their hands and arms to allow the stick to dip or rods to cross? Successful is a person who receives information about underground water from the psychic universal broadcast system. Many unusual stories came out of India, where monks in monasteries spend much of their time meditating and developing natural, preternatural or natural abilities. One day, when investigating their powers, an investigator arrived unannounced to find that they were expecting him, although they had no telephones, no radios or other means of communicating with the outside world. One of the monks, of the smallest specialized in communication, and he had telepathically communicated with another monk in another monastery who told him that this man was coming to investigate their unusual abilities. This remote monastery, another monk had developed the occult PK ability of sitting on nothing. There is a magician's trick which appears to do the same feat. However, this was carefully investigated by passing objects completely under the monk and chickens all around him, even beneath him, as he said nothing in the courtyard. The monk explained in detail how he levitated. He imagined that there was 1 cubic yard of air in front of him. Then he imagined that the cubic yard of air was solid. After this mental preparation, he said it was easy to climb up the side of the cube of air and sit on it. Simple. But it didn't work for the investigator, possibly because he could not suppress the conscious, logical mind, which said it can't be done. So, that he could not generate the ESP signal, which could have linked him with universal intelligence, who could have supported the investigator by the motion of the molecules of air and the molecules of his body, as a crude example. A helicopter is supported by the motion of molecules in the air and motion of molecules in the rotor. How to do the thought travel? That's a good question. Eileen Garrett performed an unusual experiment with the thought travel for the American Society for Psychic Research in New York. This experiment she was told to conduct a physician by ESP in Newfoundland. She had not visited the home of the doctor, nor had she met him. When she turned on her mind, she quickly found herself in the physician's house, where she was able to sense all the smells, scenes, and feelings as if she were physically present. In transcendentally visiting the doctor, who was also a psychic, she was sensed by him as being present, although she couldn't see her. She obtained special information about the doctor, which came from beyond her psychic senses, which were sensing those things inside the doctor's house. For instance, he had a bandage around his head, and she shrewdly knew that he had been in an accident and understood the details of the accident without him explaining this to her. Several objects had been laid on the tables within the doctor's home for her to detect and describe to those who were conducting the experiment. A couple of note-takers were present to write down the information as she obtained it. A few days after the experiment was conducted, the information arrived in New York by mail from the doctor in Newfoundland, telling how he had conducted the experiment from his home, and the names of the objects and details of the various tests. He didn't mention his accident, but it answered a letter of enquiries. He explained the details, which were in complete agreement with Eileen Garrett's story. Eileen apparently tuned to the universal storehouse, where all knowledge is stored, and collected only that pertaining to the experiment. Garrett's account, telepathic travel, is only one of the many of this type. Now, travel by thought is acceptable to Reverend Billy Graham. He stated in September 1969 issue of Decision, "I have a feeling," he said, "that we shall be able to travel in heaven. How fast? Now this is my private speculation. It is not in the Bible. But what is the fastest way to travel somewhere today? A thought. You think it, and you are there. Perhaps we shall be able to think. You think it, and you are there. Think our way through the universe, serving God as ambassadors to other celestial bodies. Because we are actually the sons of the living God, who runs this whole creation. That is incredible. It is impossible to believe, but the Bible teaches that we are the sons of God. Is teleportation possible? And can teleportation move objects? Let us take a step further. There are some very unusual stories around. One was, according to Clark, said by Abdullah in a story by Keith Eiling in Faith magazine in 1968 or thereabouts. Abdullah was a headman of an Arab village where Captain Dubois had healed an epidemic of diphtheria by inoculation. Abdullah explained that since these inoculations had almost stopped the spread of the disease, faith could cause continued healing, and their remaining sick people would also be quickly healed. Abdullah said to Dubois that faith could do anything. Dubois was a medical officer and was very skeptical, but Abdul quickly demonstrated one exercise of faith by turning mineral water into one of the finest champagnes. The captain considered this conjuring trick. Then Abdullah performed a real feat. He transferred a picture which was in the captain's home in Paris into the captain's hands in Arabia. The captain examined the picture, checked it, and found that there was no illusion. It was real. Back in Paris, the police did not find this event very amusing. The picture had been reported missing from the captain's home, and the police were trying to locate it. Abdullah kept the picture for 48 hours, and then, as mysteriously as it left, it was returned to the captain's home. This apparently wild story of teleportation was reported by Paris police, the French newspapers, and the London Times. Can one issue commands in thoughts? Unusual experiences and a very unique philosophy were related by Bill Davies. He and a few others interested in the occult in Huntsville experimented with ESP and other psychic phenomena for several years. Their group found that under hypnosis, a person's ESP ability can be improved tremendously. They also improved their ESP ability and performed many interesting experiments. One experiment was about transmitting a psychic request to another person who was not informed about, yet an experiment was being conducted. Bill and his brother transmitted an ESP command to individuals, urging them to phone them, and many calls came in. One person, and recognized psychic, who had received this information or impression to call Bill, asked him not to transmit because it interfered with her work. This aroused Bill's curiosity about how strong a signal his brother, who was a better transmitter than he, could send out. He asked to his brother to transmit as strong a signal possibly to the secretary, who had psychic ability, and requested that she call Bill. Very soon, he received a call from the secretary, who complained of sudden violent headache and an urgent need to call Bill during the next 4 or 5 hours. Bill received phone calls from acquaintances all over the US who felt the need to call him. So, apparently, the signal to the secretary also reached many others much farther away than she was. Bill has a theory that all behavior, psychic, psychological, moral, and physical, follows a basic, simple equation. M divided by T squared equals F divided by S, where M equals to mass, T equals to time, F equals to force, and S equals to length. Each term is a tensor, and the value in any direction. Let us label this equation, says scientist Clark, the universal equation of truth. From this equation, we can easily derive such common equations as F equals to ma, E equals to mc squared, etc. The equation can also apply to the ESP signal, pK, religious concepts, and all equitable relationships in the physical and spiritual realms. Billy feels that the equation shows the oneness of God. By moving all factors to one side of the equation, the equal force, God, or everything equals to God. There you have it. What about automatic writing? Perhaps the most carefully documented case of such writing and its special form of psychokinesis is the case of Patience Worth. This book was published in 1934 by a Dr. Walter Franklin. The automatic writing was accomplished when the individual suppressed the conscious mind so that it did not control the hand which held the pencil. The automatic writing is theoretically controlled by a spiritual being who controlled the subconscious mind, which moves the hand, and a person writes the information without the conscious knowledge of the writer being involved in the process. Now, Mrs. J. Curran, she automatically wrote the story of Patience Worth. She was a medium who had only very basic education. When she began writing, she had been never traveling outside the Midwestern US. Mrs. Curran began to pick up messages from a mysterious patient who claimed to be a young woman of English who had to come to America in the 1600s. Mrs. Curran had left school after graduating from the 8th grade. She studied voice in Chicago, where she attended and played the piano at the Spiritualist Church, where her uncle was the minister. She attended school at Protestant churches as a child, but apparently the Protestant teachings, which forbid communicating with spirits, did not make much of an impression on her. She seemed to have little interest in history, the Bible, or in psychic phenomena. Her first experience with patients was on July 8th, 1930. Mrs. Coran and some of her neighbors were playing with the occult board. She gradually obtained smoother reception. She was told by a patient who used an archaic English language, and she had lived in the 1640s to 49 or 1649, 44. Miss Coran continued to communicate with strange spirit or patient's worth until finally, instead of the slow and tedious process of letters being spelled out, Mrs. Coran could see letters in her psychic mind. After this, instead of letters, she began to see words, and finally the words developed into fascinating scenes in her mind. As this peculiar information came to Mrs. Coran, it was written down automatically, exactly as they were received. Book-length stories were dictated by Patience Worth to Mrs. Coran. Stories, The Story Town, The Fool, and The Lady, Hope, Trouble, and True Blood, and Tale. She also received many poems from Patience. The amazing progress of Mrs. Coran from board to writing the messages from Patience were phenomenal. Her progress is another indication that the subconscious mind can improve psychic communication ability with the spirit world. Developing automatic writing is very similar to that of many others who have begun by practicing Ouija board or other devices, gradually progress to automatic writing or speaking, as Patience with states. Some of those who are living do seek to communicate in certain cases with those who are not living, and then sometimes between the living and dead are possible. However, many messages from the dead are never received because the living do not really try to receive them. Unexpected kinetic mental powers. The message used by Mrs. Coran can be used successfully by many others. Her method can obtain messages from the spirit world, and if the messages come from higher intelligent beings, then they can be great improvements in our way of living in a very short period of time. It would seem from Mrs. Coran's experience that the primary method of improving our contact with this higher life is to be less reluctant to try communicating with the spirit world and simply have more faith, then contact is possible. There is a warning, however. for each person who tries to communicate with the spirit world. We would test the spirits by ourselves, that they give us factual information in agreement with the teachings of the great masters. If the spirits do not recognize Jesus, the Son of God, we should shun them. That is what the scientist Clark says. It is always advisable to talk seriously with God and listen to the Holy Spirit, and let Him help arrange the conduct with spirits. However, since there is no better contact than the Holy Spirit or God, we are safest in communicating only with Him. When we communicate with other spirits, says Clark, because there may be various levels in spirit world, we may contact a spirit at random who is at one of the lowest spirit levels. We may not have accurate information. In fact, contact with some spirits can be harmful, whereas if we seek to use the method of contact taught in the Bible, i.e. speaking to God using the Holy Spirit, with Jesus as a mediator, we can reach the highest level where information will be completely accurate. In addition, scientist Clark says, shall not receive information which is harmful to us, because the Holy Spirit judges what is best for us. There you have it. So far, thank you very much for sharing this segment. Until we meet again, keep smiling and be happy. We will meet again by the next episode. Thank you.